We're moving on to the first panel session of the day, and I have Gil, Andy, and hopefully Mark joining us. Let me just bring Mark up as well, and we should have. I can't see Mark's camera, but there he is. He's all there. Brilliant. So, if I could just whip around the panel and ask you each to give a short word of welcome and introduce yourself. Can I start with Andy? Andy.
Hey Dom, good to see you. This is Andy Batts, COO of Seaborn Networks. We have a network across the Americas delivering both capacity and IP. So looking forward to today's conversation.
Brilliant, that's excellent. And Gil, you're next up. Gil, are you out there?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, based on where you are. I'm Gil Santaliz, the CEO and founder of NJFX. NJFX is a cable landing station campus located in Wall, New Jersey. What we've uniquely done is we've interconnected subsea networks, four to be specific, the Andes cable, the Seaborn cable, the two TGN cables that Tata developed with Tyco back in the day, and the brand new Hoffer AEC2 cable with 20 plus North American carriers to create the latest domestic / international hub on the East Coast of the US. Pleasure to be with you.
Perfect. And Mark, if we could get you on camera. There we go. There's Mark.
Hi guys, Mark Cooper from InterXion. We're a pan-European data center operator, now part of the Digital Realty family since March of this year. My focus is on working with CDNs to see where are they going next and what kind of requirements they need from data center operators and from connectivity.
Okay, now I'd be tempted to focus on the COVID question, but I'm going to come to that towards the end of the discussion for the moment. So I'd like to just kick off with just a broad question. What are you guys finding are the most challenged geographies at the moment in your fields of operation? Where is it hard to deploy? Where is it hard to connect to as you deploy fiber and as you interconnect from your operations out? Andy, can I start with you?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think generally speaking, interconnectivity and region-wide connectivity. So I'm obviously focused largely on the Americas, north and south. So, I think generally speaking, connectivity and interconnections have improved dramatically. And cooperation between operators has improved dramatically, especially this year with all the added pressures that there have been. And it's actually been one of the promising outcomes of this is showing that, as an industry, we can actually cooperate together and deliver stuff quickly and do what we need to do. But there's still huge pockets of the market in the Americas where connectivity is either really challenging or just so expensive that it's actually it's restricted in terms of capabilities. And Central America, Caribbean is absolutely falls in that bracket. Underserved in terms of investment, difficult to acquire any kind of scale capacity, and just the challenges that the region itself brings in terms of multi-governmental, multi-regions. I mean, Caribbean, just take Caribbean, it's 30 plus countries, 50 million people. So, if you were to put that in the context of that, if that was a country with 30 cities and 50 million people, we'd all be building there. But
yeah,
it's all connected by oceans, so it makes it a little bit more challenging. But that's definitely one of the areas where I see, there's development needed there. There's, they just have not had any kind of real investment for at least 20 years. So there's definite opportunities, I think. But challenging for a region when, you're that disparate but that large. As a consumer base, it's huge, but it's just it's spread over so many different geographies. It's challenging.
Now, Gil, you're looking at this from a slightly different perspective, I guess, because you're kind of more geographically located and hoping that fiber and connectivity can reach you. Are you challenged by being able to reach other parts of the world or reach deeper into the US, or are you finding that you've got the connectivity that you're hoping for?
It's a great question, because over the last few years, we've seen a complete refresh on the subsea, specifically the transatlantic market. There's been plenty of new cables crossing the Atlantic with 30 times, 40 times, 100 times the capacity of the previous subsea cables that were put in place, call it in the year 2000. But we've also seen the consolidation in North America of a lot of US carriers buying each other and consolidating assets. And the same assets that supported the cables 20 years ago is supporting the cables today. Those assets are being used not only for submarine cable transmission backhaul, but they're also being used for 5G deployments. They're also being used for more connectivity for more businesses. And I would say it's lopsided. We've had a switch. We've gone from an incredible US infrastructure with limited subsea capacity to having a robust subsea infrastructure and now an overused, potentially tired domestic network in the US. And we've got these pinch points that have been created. So for example, along the East Coast, most carriers run along I-95 and they hit the Washington, DC market and the same bridges are all crossing. So you're having congestion issues. You're starting to see domestic carriers run into issues. And I think there's a concept out there being passed about Confluence running a cable along the East Coast, the wet cable, to connect Florida, Virginia, New Jersey, and create an alternate route. So we're actually using the ocean and the subsea infrastructure to turn around and solve domestic problems in the US.
Mark, how about for InterXion? Are you guys finding connecting outside of your own network challenging, or are you getting the connections that you need?
I think that's the biggest challenge. It goes back to what Dave was saying as well. It's about the demand forecasting. I mean, when you have a market like Marseille, which has become this massive interconnection hub for subsea and a gateway from Europe down into the Middle East and India, or you have a market like Frankfurt where the demand is just exploding. So for us, it's more about trying to know where the demand is going to come from, because we basically get flooded with demands for connectivity, and like COVID, great example of panic requests for cross connects because everyone's upgrading their networks. But I think the subsea stuff's going to change because with the developments in the technology, you don't have to co-locate the termination equipment at the landing point anymore. You can put that into a hub location like London or Paris, for example. So that's going to change the dynamic. But with us, it's really talk to the customers and try and stay ahead of the demand.
Oh, I forgot to take my mute. So let's do the COVID question. We were having a little debate with the moderators before the session today about whether we should actually play a drinking game and drink half a pint of beer every time COVID was mentioned through Content Delivery Summit, and just actually to keep people sober and concentrating. But we've got to do it. We've got to touch on it because it's a real thing. So it's obviously affected everything. What are, and I love this question that Gil propositioned in advance, which was what are the lasting effects to network architecture? So I often look at the fiber networks as having an almost abundant capacity. What's lit up and connected, that obviously decreases how much of the networks are actually being used. But I do feel that there's quite an abundance of available capacity that could potentially be activated. While everyone talks about COVID increasing traffic levels by 20–30% in most streaming contexts at least, are we seeing the available networking really congested, or are we seeing lasting effects to network architecture because of COVID? And I'm going to put that to Gil first because it was your question in the preamble. So Gil.
Sure. If you think through what happened after COVID sent us all from our offices to our homes, you had office buildings with huge pipes that's where the networks lived, and everyone got onto the network and managed through their data centers. And we left the offices and then went home and did entertainment and watched TV and applications. Now the home is the new office, but it happens to be pretty disaggregated across the US or across the world. And we're seeing the ISPs, the cable companies, becoming the important link to connect all these employees that have to connect back to these massive networks that they own. We've got a very large multinational bank that's doing a very creative solution with us. they've chosen to put a core network node at the cable landing station, NJFX, and they are picking up their international capacity there, eliminating points of failure. They are also working with our IXs, DKICs specifically, to do a better connection with all of the ASNs that make up the internet, but they're also getting all the Comcast, Verizons, Altices, RCNs, Windstreams of the world, getting all those residential networks onto their corporate networks sooner. They're limiting points of failure. They're limiting latency issues. They are reorchestrating how their networks work because no one is in their office. And what COVID basically taught us is that maybe those offices don't have to be as full. Maybe we're going to work from home more often. And I think this can become a permanent change, and the reorchestration of that local access to residential networks might stay around and be as important as it is today for a long period to come.
Mark, sorry, how's COVID affecting your capacity planning and so
on? Yeah, and obviously at the beginning, things went crazy. We couldn't deliver cross connects fast enough. Obviously, then you have the challenge as well of being able to have the staff on site to cope with all the requests that were coming in. That's kind of dropped off now. And I think the change we're seeing is that, and Andy touched on it as well, is more cooperation between the operators. It's not so much as they're fierce competitors, but there's more cooperation. People recognise there's need for redundancy and resilience as well, and that's something that has really been triggered by COVID, I think.
And Andy, Dave was talking about the sort of 36-month planning cycle to provision fibre. Now, I'm guessing things. My experience of the carrier world is it does move in glacial timeframes compared to the application space and so on. Has COVID affected what Seaborn is up to, or is there going to be a sort of not a fiscal drag but a technical drag that's going to show itself in 36 months' time or whatever it may be?
Well, I think that, as Mark kind of suggested there, the big impact was, we went through a period that kind of March through April, back into March and the entire period of April, where we probably delivered as much transport capacity, core capacity, just wavelengths, that we probably forecasted from an engineering perspective for the whole of the year. So we delivered pretty much a year's worth of capacity in 6 weeks. Now, fortunately, we had that available capacity, already in service and lit, ready to be used. What it's actually done is brought forward our planning activities to increment that capacity at the core network level. I think what's been more interesting from a network capacity and capability perspective has been a refocus on, in subsea, people talk a lot about latency and how short a cable is and how direct a cable is. And to a large degree, that's become irrelevant over the last 9 months. What's now important is service latency. What's the latency between, like, you and me right now? What's the latency between you sitting on your camera and me sitting on my camera? And that's got, the subsea might play a little part in that, but it's more about, for us, it's been about orchestrating our IP network to get ourselves both in the region and outside the region much closer to the content platforms so that service latency is reduced. Because that's what people are seeing the difference in now. You think about all these different applications and platforms where we're reaching out to either communicate or entertain or work. Service latency and relative service latency is really important now. And from a IP orchestration perspective, that's important. But as Mark mentioned, from a cooperation perspective, because you got to think of it in terms of sustaining service. So it's not just about what's Seaborn doing for relative latency. It's what are we doing in conjunction with GlobeNet and Sparkle and Telxius and Angola and everybody else to make sure that the various different paths achieve the same relative latency so that the experience for the end user is the same. That's been a dramatic change this year, I think, a realization that physical latency is actually irrelevant. It's service latency.
Propagation delay versus application latency.
Absolutely.
So, and just a quick reminder to the audience, do post questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window if you want to get questions through to me to put to the panels, or through to any of the other moderators to put to the panels. Actually, one of the other moderators, Tim's, popped in a question, which was a response to Gil's previous comments. He highlighted, you mentioned creating confluence by using a wet cable along the Atlantic seaboard to solve domestic traffic issues, rather than having to use the congested I-95 corridor. So his question is whether the wet cable stays within 12 miles of the Atlantic coast, or whether that's passing into international waters and presents data security and privacy issues. That's an interesting issue. I suppose you cross borders in almost every circumstance with subsea, and running fibers around oceans will be running in and out of international waters. So, Gil, do you have any thoughts about or comments to that issue? I think more than a question.
The developers of that cable, will have to make some hard choices about how far off the coast they go. There's a continental shelf that's there. So to stay on the shelf, you're going to be in shallower water. Therefore, you have to bury your cable. The cost goes dramatically higher. You do save on some latency issues by staying on shelf. If you go off shelf, it's going to cost more in terms of more cable, but actually less in construction costs. The ship can move a lot faster if it's not having to bury the cable off the shelf, and yet a little more latency to the project. To be determined still in terms of how the US government considers that a domestic or an international cable, because yes, once you're a certain number of miles off our coast, you're considered quote unquote international. I don't know yet how they're going to treat it. Will they treat it as a true domestic cable, or they put an international spin on it itself? And the fact that it lands in cable landing stations, it's going to have a little bit of both, because in those buildings also exist transatlantic cables as well. The cable systems is going to basically connect the most important cable landing stations on our East Coast.
It's an interesting space because, of course, I guess the carriers still hold to mere conduit in terms of general policy and so on. It's much more about storage of data that presents a challenge. But I'm venturing into an area I'm learning rather than know about. So, but maybe actually that's a good segue to Mark. So, Mark, you know, with this change in utilization of the networks as people have been moving into the home and so on, has that changed how you're planning your capacity in different metro zones, and where you're then looking to connect onto the subsea cables and so on, and bring capacity into, say, continental Europe and so on and so forth? What have you seen changing over the last few months?
Maybe not in the last few months. Obviously, we have Marseille, which has developed into this fantastic kind of showpiece of what you can do with subsea in combination with carrier neutral DC space. What we've been doing is kind of looking ahead and, okay, so what's the next Marseille? Is it Bordeaux? Could it be Rome in Italy? So the process we're going through now is, and again, goes back to what Dave was saying about edge cities. It's where do we go next? And where do we think the next kind of demand is going to come from? So that's where we were looking. In the core flat markets, that demand just keeps coming. It's almost impossible to keep up with it because there's so much demand coming from the platforms, coming from the content owners, the CDNs. So it's more about what are those next markets. So for us, Rome is an example where we're building there, and looking how we can establish that as almost a secondary location to Marseille and bring new subsea systems into that market. Because at the moment everything hubs into Milan, and Milan's not a good location for serving the whole of Italy from. So we're looking to kind of stimulate a secondary hub in the country, and then we'll look further into other markets. So we had a recent announcement about Croatia as well.
And do you face power challenges? Is it a struggle to find power? Going back to some conversation.
Yeah. I mean, we're generally very good at kind of contracting ahead. So, engaging with, in the end, it's not so much the availability of the power, it's the availability of the substations and their ability to deliver the power. So we work closely with the people that own the grid and the power suppliers to kind of future contracts to make sure that we can meet the demand. And it's that lag of a substation. Substation can take 5 years to be built, so it's kind of staying ahead of that piece, not so much as being able to actually contract for the power.
Okay, perfect. Andy, so question for you. I spoke to Dave about the major fiber project that he'd been involved with at Microsoft. It makes me wonder, what are the key tipping points when building is better than buying, and at what point would a large organization sit there and say, do you know what, we'd actually do better if we just ran our own cable rather than bought it from third-party providers? Are there tipping points where you get effectively a new customer? What are the big decisions that lead to that?
Well, I think it's largely driven by route, and then at the end of the day, it comes down to demand, bandwidth. And you look at the hyperscalers, we're now seeing an environment which is actually really healthy, where for the major hub routes, so you look at US to Europe, you look at LA down to Chile on the west coast of the Americas, you look Trans-Pacific, and you're basically seeing one or two things: either a really large hyperscaler saying, we're just going to build it ourselves day one. We're going to put so many fiber pairs on it, and if we can use them all, great. If we can swap some of them for other routes that we need with other hyperscalers or carriers, that's great too. But we're going to put the cash up day one. We're going to put the whole cash up and do it ourselves. And that's great. That's really healthy. It's developing, it's either creating new routes between hubs, or it's supplementing and maintaining routes, because it's all about, at the end of the day, even for well-known routes like transatlantic, yes, there are build cycles, but you're always looking to maintain it. You can't wait until it's too late to start building again. I think what's more interesting is when you look at a regional level, and at a regional level, it's a much more complicated question, because there is not one player that's sitting there saying, I'm going to build a cable all by myself. You've really got to work hard, cooperate, and correlate needs and demands to effectively create the connections from those major hubs that the big guys are building to the rest of the region, in terms of bring everyone there. Because at the end of the day, it's about distributing, whether it's content or data or applications, whatever it is. The big links are only as good as the on-ramps to get to them, and they're the regional networks. And that's where it gets really interesting, I think, where you do have to play a much more moderated role in terms of cooperating with multi-parties, and not necessarily old consortium type models, but there's some co-build that initiatives going on right now. I think that's the interesting arena, to make sure that, yes, we got these big routes going in with 16 fiber pairs, 24 fiber pairs, huge pipes in terms of bandwidth. But how do we distribute that once it reaches these major hubs? That's the interesting piece as far as modeling.
Interesting. That's actually a reasonably good segue over to Gil here. So obviously, one way to increase capacity for particularly something like content delivery of live streaming or on-demand video, the big sort of giants in the network space in terms of utilization at the moment. One way to do it is to add fiber. Another way to do it is to add more efficient caching or stream splitting in the application layer. Do you, as ostensibly a host or a colo operator, do you see either strategy having any particular dominance at the moment? Are people adding more capacity, or are they adding more caching and compute in the at the colo facilities?
So at a cable landing station, typically many folks weren't invited to come visit. There wasn't really room for caching. Wasn't really room for lots of carriers. What we did, similar to what Marseille did with InterXion, was we created a cable landing station campus with the ability to provide high density, low density power applications, so that caching is a possibility. So we built a tier 3 site 64 feet above sea level, where you could actually do a combination of data center hosting as well as interconnecting subsea cables. So you get your choice. You can pick one of 4 subsea cables, 5 to be soon, and you can cache all the information, and you go back of the router between the different providers that exist, the cable companies with all the eyeballs, the content providers and managers and network operators that want to deliver that content. It's really the best of both scenarios. And I think you're going to see more of that. You know, you asked a great question before about getting power to the edge, and think about where the ocean represents. It's the edge, right? The power company gets to the end of their network, and there goes the ocean. You know, we got very lucky with Wall Township, New Jersey, that the utility supported having us have that much power in advance. So we can do both. We provide robust power solutions, and we have the ultimate subsea networks. And we benefited from the fact that New York City sits 60 miles north of us. Philadelphia is 50 miles west of us. Ashburn is 226 miles south of us, equidistant from Virginia Beach. So we're in a pretty good position to serve all markets, whether it's New York Metro traffic, Philly traffic, North America, or Ashburn. Our cables are equidistant as the ones in Virginia Beach going to Ashburn. So you've got the best of both worlds.
Okay, cool. And Mark, just a last 3-minute question from me here. So obviously the next big rollout that everyone's talking about, at least, whether quite how big it's going to be, who knows, is obviously 5G. We're seeing a lot of talk about it, a lot of hype. Can you just talk to me a little bit about how you're capacity planning as 5G is emerging? Because although that is right at the other end of the spectrum and into the access space, we're going to be focusing just before lunch.
Yeah,
you need data to get into that network and across the POPs to be able to actually meet that sort of demand. So can you just talk to me a little bit about 5G and what your capacity planning as InterXion is for 5G?
yeah, sure. I mean, we actually look at it slightly differently. I mean, everyone talks about 5G and it's 5G and the edge and everything. In the end, 5G it's a technology that enables the applications. So we focus on what are the applications that are going to use 5G and try and predict what are those applications and where the data flow is going to go to. So rather than just focusing on 5G as a thing, it's going to happen, the network's already rolled out. We try and capture the aggregation points, so that when the applications come that run over 5G, we have the traffic running through, and we know that the traffic's going from the end user to whether it's going to Amazon or Microsoft, or even to an enterprise's hosted capacity. So we're trying to predict what are those applications, and that's really difficult right now because everyone talks about autonomous cars, AR, VR, IoT, but there's no real edge applications yet. So there's a lot of kind of maneuvering and trying to think and predict what it is. But for us, 5G important, but in the end, it's just a network. It's the same as any other network, and it's about the applications and trying to figure out what those applications are.
Listen, guys, absolutely fascinating panel. It's always great. It's interesting for me because it's actually just on the edge, having spent 20 years in the CDN industry, it's just on the edge of my knowledge, some of this stuff. And it's a very deep part of the content delivery ecosystem, which often gets forgotten about up in the CDN layer. But it's absolutely fantastic to have you guys on. I really appreciate it. So Mark, Gil, thank you so much once again. I can't see you, Mark, but I can spotlight Andy to say thank you very much.
Well done.
And same to Gil. There he is. And I know Mark's turned his camera back on or whatever it is. So thanks so much, guys. It's been really appreciated. Stay in touch. Look forward to seeing you for the next Content Delivery Summit.